I've been a priest for nearly 20 years. I've heard every kind of confession, sins whispered in guilt, sobbed in regret, muttered in anger. I thought nothing could unsettle me anymore. But this was different. It was late October, and the air inside St. Mark's Church carried the scent of old wood and melted candle wax. The evening service had ended hours ago, leaving the chapel silent but for the occasional creak of the aging structure. I was making my final rounds before locking up when I heard it. Knock, knock. It was soft at first, like the timid tap of a child's fingers against the wood. I turned, my gaze settling on the row of confessionals lining the far end of the church. Most were still in use, polished and well-maintained. But there was one, the last one, shrouded in shadow, that hadn't been used in decades. I hesitated. That confessional had been locked for as long as I could remember. The door had warped with age, the hinges rusted, the wood darkened from years of neglect. Even the air around it felt different, thicker, colder. Knock, knock. A slow, deliberate rhythm. Not hurried, not frantic, just insistent. I stepped forward, my footsteps echoing in the empty nave. "Hello?" I called out, my voice barely above a whisper. Silence. I reached for the handle, and a layer of dust clung to my fingertips. I hesitated. It was impossible. The lock was rusted shut. No one could have gotten inside. And yet, I pulled the door open. A rush of air swept past me, unnaturally cold, stirring the dust into swirling specters that danced in the dim candlelight. I held my breath, peering inside. The confessional was empty, but something was wrong. The wooden kneeler was coated in dust, except for two distinct impressions where knees had pressed into it. My pulse quickened. Someone had been here. I swallowed, my throat dry as I leaned closer. That was when I saw it, carved into the inside of the door, deep into the aged wood. A name. The letters were jagged, uneven, as though etched by an unsteady hand. The sight of it sent a shiver down my spine. I recognized the name. It belonged to Father Elias Morel, a priest who had vanished from this church almost a century ago, a man whose disappearance had never been explained. A cold dread settled over me. I could still feel it, that eerie presence lingering in the air, watching from the dark corners of the church. The silence stretched, heavy and suffocating, before a sound cut through it. A whisper, low, breathy, impossible to decipher, but I felt it, felt the icy tendrils of something unseen brushing against me. The door creaked, the candlelight flickered violently, and then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the feeling was gone. I stepped back, my breath coming in quick, uneven gasps. My instinct screamed at me to leave, to turn away and pretend this never happened. But I couldn't. Instead, I reached up and pressed my palm to the name carved into the wood. The letters were cold beneath my fingers, colder than the rest of the confessional, colder than they should have been. I whispered a prayer, my voice shaking. Then I shut the door. I never reopened it. But sometimes, when I'm alone in the church at night, I hear it. Knock, knock. And it isn't the first time strange things have happened here. More than once, I've seen candles extinguish themselves in unison, as if a great breath had blown through the chapel. Footsteps echo on the stone floor when no one else is inside. The statues of saints, motionless and solemn, sometimes cast shadows that shift when I'm not looking. One night, while locking up, I heard the faint strains of the church organ playing. It was a slow, mournful melody, the kind that burrows into your bones. But when I climbed to the organ loft, the keys were moving on their own. I stood frozen, watching as the unseen hands played the final notes before falling silent. I checked the dust-covered bench, expecting to see marks, some sign that someone had been there. There was nothing. And then there were the voices. Late at night, when the world outside is quiet, I sometimes hear prayers whispered from empty pews, faint, pleading voices that fade the moment I try to focus on them. And yet, the feeling lingers, like someone is still there, waiting, watching. These things I have learned to live with. But the confessional, that confessional is different. I still hear the knocking, and every time I do, I wonder, is it Father Morell trying to return after all these years? Or is it something else entirely? I had been working at St. Benedict's for 3 years when I first heard it, the pipe organ. It was impossible. The instrument had been silent for over 50 years. The pipes were clogged with dust, the keys warped, the bellows riddled with holes. No one had played it in decades. And yet, as I stood by the heavy wooden doors, locking up for the night, a low, mournful note drifted through the cavernous church. I froze. The sound came from the organ loft above me, a single note stretching into the stillness like a held breath. The church was empty. It had been for hours. I turned slowly, my pulse quickening, eyes fixed on the darkened balcony where the organ sat shrouded in shadow. The air around me felt different, thicker, colder, charged with something unseen. A shiver crawled down my spine as I forced my feet forward toward the narrow staircase leading up to the loft. Each step creaked beneath me, the sound swallowed by the heavy silence of the church. I gripped the railing tightly, my fingers slick with sweat, my mind racing for a logical explanation. A draft? The settling of old wood. Anything but what I truly feared. Then the music started. A deep, eerie melody, slow and deliberate, filled the vast space. It was not a hymn. It was nothing I recognized. Each note rang out in perfect, deliberate succession, resonating through the empty nave. I reached the top of the stairs. The organ was playing. The keys moved, not fully pressing down, but shivering, as though unseen fingers barely brushed them. The stops were pulled at random, some open, some closed, shifting without any visible force. I couldn't breathe. I stepped closer, my breath shallow, my heart hammering against my ribs. The melody climbed higher, swelling into something sorrowful, something desperate. The pipes groaned, rattling as though they struggled against the passage of time itself. I stood frozen, watching as the unseen hands played on. Then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the music stopped. The final note lingered, stretching impossibly long before fading into silence. I swallowed hard, willing myself forward, my hand hovering over the keys. They were ice cold, colder than they should have been, colder than anything in that old church had a right to be. Then I saw it. A single fingerprint in the dust, not mine. I stared at it, my breath caught in my throat. The dust had been undisturbed for years, thick, untouched. But now, a single mark stood out starkly against the pale film. The print was smudged slightly, as if someone had rested their fingertip there before vanishing into the night. I backed away slowly, my mind screaming for me to run, but my legs wouldn't obey. The silence around me had changed. It wasn't empty, it was expectant. I forced myself down the stairs, each step heavier than the last. I locked the church doors and left, but I didn't sleep that night. I never heard the organ again, but every time I went up to clean, there were new prints in the dust. And sometimes, late at night, when the wind is still and the church is silent, I swear I can hear it. A single trembling note hanging in the darkness, waiting for someone to listen. And then, one night, I did something different. I prayed. The moment I began whispering the words, the sound intensified. The organ moaned. The keys trembled. The pipes shuddered, as if straining to speak, to tell me something I couldn't understand. The vibrations hummed through the air, wrapping around me, pressing against my skin. And yet, no one else ever heard it. I asked my colleagues, the parishioners, even a visiting bishop. No one else had ever noticed a sound. At first, it terrified me, but in time, the fear faded. It never harmed me. It never asked for anything. It was simply there, a presence, a sound, a whisper from something long forgotten. And now, on the nights when the church is silent, when the organ does not play, I feel uneasy, as if something is missing, as if somehow I have grown accustomed to the voice in the dark. On my wedding day, I was so nervous I could barely breathe. My hands trembled as I clutched my bouquet, my heartbeat thrumming louder than the church bells. The guests blurred into a haze of pastel dresses and dark suits. All I could focus on was my husband, the altar, and the weight of the vows we whispered to each other. But there was one thing I did notice. Her. She stood at the very back of the church, just beyond the last row of guests. A woman in a dark dress, hands clasped in front of her, watching. She wasn't smiling. She wasn't crying. She just stared. At first, I assumed she was from my husband's side of the family. Maybe a distant relative, someone I hadn't met before. But there was something about her that made my stomach twist. A presence too still, too deliberate, as if she didn't belong. The air around her seemed heavier, like the light bent differently in that space. Even from a distance, I could see her eyes were fixed on me, unblinking, unwavering. I swallowed hard and forced my gaze back to my husband, willing the unease away. But it didn't leave me. Throughout the ceremony, I kept catching glimpses of her out of the corner of my eye. She never moved, never shifted, just watched. A chill ran through me despite the warmth of the candles burning along the aisle. When the ceremony ended and we turned to walk down the aisle, I looked back. She was gone. At the reception, between laughter and champagne toasts, the memory of her lingered like a shadow. I asked my husband about her, describing the woman in the dark dress. He frowned, shaking his head. I didn't see anyone like that. I asked my mother, my bridesmaids, even the photographer who had captured every moment from the moment I stepped into the church. No one remembered her. A prickle of unease crawled up my spine. It didn't make sense. She had been right there. That night, after the celebration faded and we were alone in our hotel room, I dreamt of her. In my mind, she stood closer than before, her dark dress blending into the shadows of the room. I couldn't see her face, only the hollow presence of her gaze pressing against me. A week later, When we got our wedding photos back, I scrolled through them with a creeping sense of dread. She wasn't in a single one, not in the aisle, not lingering in the background, not anywhere. But I know what I saw. And sometimes, late at night, when the house is silent and my husband is asleep beside me, I find myself staring at those photos again. My finger hovers over the images, scanning the rows of guests, searching for any trace of her. Last night, I woke up to the sound of rustling fabric. My breath hitched as I turned over, my eyes adjusting to the dim glow of the streetlight filtering through the curtains. The room was still, my husband's soft breathing steady beside me, but the air felt thick, weighted, as if something unseen pressed against my chest. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw it, the edge of a dark dress disappearing into the mirror's reflection. I sat up, my pulse hammering, but the room was empty. The mirror, once facing away from the bed, was now angled slightly toward me. I don't remember moving it. Now, every night, I wake to the same sensation, that lingering weight in the air, that whisper of movement just beyond my vision. The mirror never stays where I leave it, and sometimes, in the silence of the dark, I swear I hear someone breathing. Someone who isn't my husband. I don't know who she is. I don't know what she wants, but I'm starting to think she never left the church. She just followed me home.